Chapter 8, Operational Training, Bomber Command. Silverstone, to most people, is the motor racing track in Northampton where the British Grand Prix Formula 1 race is held annually. However, in 1944 it was number 17 Operational Training Unit, R.A.F. Bomber Command, where future bomber crews carried out the training on Vickers, Wellington Mk3 and X aircraft. It was to this unit that I reported on the 5th of March, 1944, but regrettably it was not to be a happy place for me. Firstly, the plan for my training was that I would fly about 50 hours of training on Wellingtons and then go on to the de Havilland and Mosquito bombers, which were then the much sought after choice to fly on bomber operations. I soon found out that there was some hostility amongst the staff to someone who had not already done a tour of bomber ops, going straight on to Mosquitoes. One instructor whom I flew with on my early conversion to Wellingtons made this quite plain to me. Despite this attitude, I was able to go ahead and do the 3 weeks ground training and then to start flying. With the connivance of the squadron leader flight commander, who was an aggressive, unpleasant sort of man, they managed to have my posting changed to go on to what was known as main force. This change meant that I would go on to a normal bomber course and on to Stirling or Lancaster bombers. I challenged the flight commander and we had a very unpleasant row over the change. As normal in these cases, the staff view prevailed, and following my early Wellington conversion, I was posted to another OTU. There was a twist to this unfortunate experience, for I later learned that the flight lieutenant who had voiced his disapproval of my Mosquito posting took it on instead and was subsequently killed. This only goes to show that often the initial victor doesn't always win in the long run. The second reason for my unhappiness at Silverstone was probably a product of the first. Because of the unpleasant feeling between the staff and myself, I was unhappy and felt very homesick for my wife and my new little girl, now aged 3 months. I moved away from Silverstone to a new OTU, namely number 26 at R.A.F. Wing in Buckinghamshire, after a most enjoyable week's leave in Carnarvon with my wife and daughter. What a change occurred at Wing, where I found a total reversal of attitude amongst the staff. Squadron leader Bob Bradley, the chief ground instructor, made me most welcome. I was to serve under him again some 20 years later in Singapore. Meanwhile, let's look at Wing and my next bout of training. As I had done the ground school and early conversion training on the Wellington, he asked me if I would be interested in taking over an existing crew who had lost their pilot due to illness. I said I would certainly like to meet them and see how we got on. I shall never forget our first meeting when Bob Bradley took me to where they were helping paint the ground instruction block, whilst awaiting a new captain. All 6 of them were sergeants, and at the time I met them, all covered in paint. They were a real bunch of characters and I took to them at once. One important point about them was that 5 of them were, like me, Londoners, and that helped. The other 2 were from Liverpool and Sydney. The crew comprised the following: Cy Barrett, Bomb MA, Johnny Mansfield, Navigator, Don McDonald, Flight Engineer, Sheik Hen, Wireless Operator, R.A.A.F, Alex DL, Mid-Upper Turret Gunner, and Les Davies, Rear Gunner. The first 5 were Londoners, although Johnny Mansfield now lived in Brighton, Les Davies the Liverpudlian, and Sheik Hen, the Aussie. At first I think they were a little unsure of me, since I was a flying officer and they were all sergeants and the former captain had been a sergeant as well. Once they had chatted with me and learned that I was also a Londoner and a pilot with about 1,000 hours experience, they were quite reassured that we would get along fine. When Bob Bradley asked me how I felt about taking over this crew, I told them that I was quite happy to do so, and he said he had found them really good bunch. For whilst they had to hang around for a new pilot, they had been willing and cheerful. I had done the first part of the OTU training and so had they, so we were able to get down to flying as a crew immediately. We started flying on the 2nd of May after we had moved to the R.A.F. Wing Satellite Airfield at R.A.F. Little Horwood near Winslow. This plan enables us to quickly settle down as a crew. Although I was now beginning to enjoy flying the Wellington, we did have a setback due to an engine malfunction. I was flying with the crew solo as pilot and carrying out an approach and landing just as I throttled back on the engines. There was no response. I careered down the runway and finally swung the aircraft round to avoid crashing through a hedge and ditch. As I ground looped, the undercarriage collapsed and bits started flying off everywhere and we came to a fairly shattering stop. Out came all the fire engines and an ambulance, but we were all okay and there was no fire. After an initial medical examination, we were let go. The wing commander flying carried out an investigation and told me I could continue flying as the cause of the accident was an engine malfunction. Examination revealed the throttle linkage had broken, thereby leaving the power on the engines as it had been when I tried to close the throttles. It was suggested that I could have possibly solved the problem by cutting off both engines by shutting off the fuel, but this is something a pilot with so little time on the aircraft could be excused from not doing. After that incident we never really looked back and the crew said that they felt I had handled the situation well. Since it could have been made much worse if I had not deliberately swung the aircraft round. Possibly we may have crashed a lot more heavily into ditches and other obstructions, and as no one was injured. All was well. Gladys had come down to stay with me for a week at a beautiful thatched roof cottage in the local village owned by a very nice widow. My wife's parents had kindly agreed to look after our baby to enable us to have some time together. She heard the crash siren sound out from the airfield when I crashed, but fortunately had not realized it was my aircraft. That evening we were out for a walk when a Queen Mary articulated truck went by with the wreckage of my aircraft on it, which gave her considerable concern when she saw what a wreck it was. After the happy week together, Gladys returned to Carnarvon. These wartime interludes when we could be with one another were very precious. The time at Little Harwood drew to an end and, despite the crash, my crew and I had worked up to be a good team. I was quite enjoying flying the Wellington, which I settled into with some competence and confidence. Despite the fact that I was the only officer in the crew, we were able to get out together from time to time, mainly to visit local pubs. It was summer and time off could be enjoyed in the lovely Buckinghamshire countryside. We returned to Wing late in May to continue our operational training, which had another month to run. The final stage of the course comprised mainly long cross countries, day and night, with routes designed to carry out a bombing sector over one of the many practice ranges in UK. This built up the simulation to an operational bombing sortie. We also carried out fighter defense practices known as fighter affiliation, when a friendly fighter carried out diving attacks on our aircraft, giving the gunners the chance to practice their skills using a cine camera. The subsequent film could be assessed to show the gunners how effective they had been in defending the aircraft. At the end of May a very tragic crash occurred at Wing. I was to fly with Flying Officer Hubbard on a night training flight and around tea time, he flew on an air test. His aircraft had a dramatic engine failure on its takeoff run whilst both engines were at full power. The aircraft swerved off the runway and crashed into one of the large hangars on the airfield. A catastrophic fire broke out, engulfing the aircraft and its crew and causing a huge fire to the hangar. The crew died in the fire and several ground personnel also burned to death. Also a number of other aircraft and vehicles also went up in flames. I was in the officers' mess having afternoon tea when a call came over the Tannoy public address system for all available personnel to come to the area. On arrival we were marshaled to nearby hangars and buildings which were under threat, to remove valuable aircraft and equipment. It was a really devastating scene of carnage and chaos, giving me a sense of deep shock at this tragedy with the enormity of it all. The fire was brought under control and as it was wartime, we carried on with our training that evening. My crew and I flew with another instructor who gave me a check flight before sending us off on solo night circuits and landings. It was a night in which we all felt pretty edgy, but the flight went off without undue incident. I really felt sad about Dickie Hubbard as I had found him to be a gentleman and a delightful person to fly with as my instructor. He had done tour of bomber ops, and it seemed such a terrible way for him and the other crew to die in such an accident. We were now about to go through a very dramatic but exciting period of history. It was June and for weeks the whole country had waited expectantly for the invasion of France, the Second Front, to be launched. There was a tremendous build-up throughout the south of England as convoy after convoy travelled down to the invasion ports. Day and night the British and American air forces had been attacking targets in France as a prelude to the invasion. We at Wing were put on special alert and training was temporarily suspended in case we might be used in some way or another in support of the invasion. On the night of the 5th of June we were all given varying forms of guard duties and we knew the invasion was imminent. On the morning of the 6th of June, General Eisenhower's dramatic announcement of the invasion came over the radio. There followed anxious days for the whole nation as we waited news of the invasion. Relief took over as the success of gaining the bridgehead in Normandy was reported. As the days passed and further successes were announced, we realized that the Allies were now entering France in large numbers and beginning to fan out to drive the Germans out of the countries they had overrun in 1940. Things having settled down somewhat, our training went ahead. We carried out further more advanced night training bomber operations, linking up with aircraft and crews and training from all over Bomber Command. These later trips gave the scenes of realism to our training and we began to feel ready for further operations over Germany. Finally, after some 90 hours of training, my crew and I were posted to number 1651 Heavy Conversion Unit at R.A.A.F. Ratting Common, near Cambridge. We were to convert onto short Sterling 4-engined bombers. Before reporting, we were given a week's leave and a week at R.A.A.F. Feltwell and Norfolk learning emergency drills in parachuting and dinghy training. This interlude took us up to mid-July when we reported to Ratting Common for the 6 weeks course. The first 2 weeks were taken up with ground training covering the technical side of the Sterling, its systems and its equipments. We were now in number 3 bomber group and we began to feel that, at last, our training was nearing completion and it would not be too long before we went to an operational squadron and the group. The Sterlings were gradually being phased out from squadrons which were in the final stages of converting to the mighty Avro Lancaster bomber. For some years the Sterling had been the only 4-engine bomber, but, although a pleasant aircraft to fly, its performance left something to be desired. On the ground it was somewhat ungainly in appearance, with a long spindly undercarriage and a high nose, with wings rather short in proportion to its length. Apparently, the aircraft had needed to be redesigned, firstly by shortening the wingspan to get that aircraft into the standard-sized hangars, and secondly, the undercarriage extended to allow the bomb trolleys to get under the bomb bay and load the bombs, etc. So goes the story and I've yet to hear it challenged. The Sterling did not carry the high bomb load the Lancaster could carry, and neither could it fly as high or as fast as the Lancaster and the Halifax, although the latter was still limited in bomb carrying capacity. Losses to Sterlings had been very high, due to the limited performance, and the ability of the German defenses to bring them down. The other less redeeming feature of the Sterling was that its undercarriage was operated up and down by an electrical system. This was not a problem unless you were doing circuits and landings which put a heavy load on the batteries. After every few landings, one had to waste time circling around to build up the batteries. On completion of the 2 weeks ground course, we begin the flying conversion phase. My instructor was a New Zealander, a Flight Lieutenant Beckcroft, who had just completed a tour of ops. On number 75, NZ, Squadron, there were a lot of Kiwis on the staff as 75 Squadron was in 3 group and after their ops, they came to the heavy conversion unit. Beckcroft had a chap, another student, Alan Rowe, and he and I got on well together. My first solo on the Sterling, which I did at R.A.F. Oakington, was eventful in that I had a burst main tire. I handled the aircraft safely to a stop without further damage and had to wait for a wheel and tire to come from Ratting Common and ground crew to change it. Not the best way to enjoy one's first solo on a new type. As one would expect, the ungainly Sterling, when on the ground, took a bit of hard work to taxi, take off and to control after the tail came down on landing. This was due to a high angle of incidence causing a rather restricted area for rudder control when the tail and the fin was down, partially blanked off from the airflow. In the air it was a delightful aircraft to handle, with a smooth feeling of control, plus the comparative quietness of the 4 Hercules radial engines. The flying training took the form rather similar to the OTU training, but of shorter duration and less flying hours. In all we flew around 45 hours at HCU. Whilst at Ratting Common, Alan Rowe and I decided to try and find some accommodation for ourselves and our wives, so as to have some time with them before we went on ops. Everyone we spoke to said we had no show of getting any accommodation near the base. There was a farmhouse near the main gate to the camp, so we decided to ask the advice of the farmer. To our delight and surprise, they offered to put up Alan and his wife and Gladys and I for a couple of weeks stay. The funny part of this arrangement was that ended up being nearer to the flight office than when we were in the camp accommodation, being just outside the main gate. When there was any hanging around to do, we went to our digs and one of our crew would come and get us when we had to report back. In fact, we got to the flight office quicker than anyone else could. The farmer and his wife were lovely country folk, very hospitable and friendly, and we really felt at home. On our evenings we would all get onto our bikes and visit the local pubs, all well known to the farmer and his wife. It really was an enjoyable period. The flying was good, the weather lovely, and we had our wives with us. Cambridge was only a few miles away and we often visited that lovely city. We did feel some tension as our wives knew we would soon be facing the greater dangers of bomb ops, where the casualties were very high, around 50%. However, one faced these situations in the war with good humor and faith, making the most of our times together. The short holidays and periods of leave were always a mixture of extreme happiness and sadness at passing when they came to an end. We had one final phase to go through, and that was a week's conversion course on the Lancaster. My crew and I were given a week's leave and then posted to No. 3 Lancaster finishing school at R.A.A.F Feltwell, which was situated about 5 miles from Brandon in Norfolk and about 20 miles from the famous horse racing area of Newmarket. It was through a rather isolated area generally. My crew and I were really looking forward to flying in the Lancaster. We were not disappointed. Here was the Rolls-Royce of bombers and they were a thrill to fly. I took to the Lancat once and had no trouble learning to fly it. One of the instructors was Harry Shapley, who had been with me at Lendrog and who had just finished a tour of ops on Lancasters. He suggested that he fly with me and I readily agreed. The week's flying was really enjoyable and relaxed. The Lancaster conversion covered 13 hours of flying, culminating in another big night training exercise with aircraft from many other OTUS and HCUS. So, at last we were really to go on ops. And the long wait for me had ended. I had always hoped to have got onto a squadron a year or so early, and that had been a big frustration and disappointment. At one time I had thought that the war might end before I ever saw an operational squadron. Now I was about to go into action, and at that stage of the war when Bomber Command was at its peak in aircraft equipment and supporting services. Earlier on in the war so many brave men had given their lives in what was a rather futile method of attack, but now we could really hit the enemy hard where it hurt. My crew and I couldn't wait to give the Germans some of what we had suffered in London. Our posting came through and we were to join No. 218, Gold Coast, Squadron at R.A.F Methild, just a few miles from Feltwell. 218 had just suffered a heavy loss of crews on a raid on Frankfurt and we were to be one of the replacement crews. The next chapter will tell the tale of our tour on Lancaster bombers. I was then still only 22 years of age, but at last I really was to become an operational pilot.